Welcome to HorrorBabble. The ghost stories of H.R. Wakefield continues today with a strange tale by the name of The Third Coach, which first appeared in his collection They Return at Evening in 1928. We hope you enjoyed. The Third Coach by H.R. Wakefield. The only objection I have to the Royal Porrick Golf Club is that the 6th green is only separated by a narrow lane from the Royal Porrick Lunatic Asylum, or rather from its exercise enclosure, the saddest playground I have ever seen. So-called mad people fill me with dread, and yet a certain shamefaced fascination. There, but for the grace of God, goes Martin trapped, though why that grace stopped short of these poor lost souls is a curious mystery understood only by reverend gentlemen. So, whenever I was approaching the 6th green, a hole I played by some muscular aberration consistently well, I felt a flickering unease, hoping to heaven the inmates were locked in their cells. Yet if they were out at their pathetic exercises, I could not keep my eyes off them. There was one considerable compensation, however, in this proximity, for it was through it that I made the acquaintance of Lanton, one of the asylum doctors. I not only took a strong personal liking for him, but he interested me deeply. He is a distinguished alienist, and passionately absorbed in the study of insanity, and yet at the same time he detests his job. Many a time he has had to cancel a round with me, and nearly always for the same reason, that he has been assaulted by a patient. Didn't get the hyoscine hydrobromide, or whatever it was, in quite quick enough, he will say, as he surveys me quizzingly, yet wearily, through a pair of rainbow eyes. And the asylum chairs are infernally hard. It took 4 of our strongest warders to keep him from creating a vacancy on the staff. As time went on, the strain began to tell, and he has lost his resiliency. But he has always remained a charming and, I felt, heroic person. He has promised to chuck it if he gets a definite danger signal, for he has the wrong temperament to resist the withering experiences of his day's work much longer. Those patients who are allowed out take their daily walk along a deserted by-road which runs parallel to the 3rd hole, and one day when I was playing with Lanton, that shuffling, damned parade was passing by just as I hit a quick, short hook into the hedge bordering the road. As I walked towards it, my eye was caught by an individual walking alone and writing busily in a notebook. He was dressed in a round, clerical hat, a dog collar, a clerical frock coat, a pair of riding breeches, and brown boots. As I approached, he looked up at me with an extremely penetrating, cunning, and yet preoccupied expression on his face. And then he went on with his writing. When we had finished the round, I described him to Lanton and asked who he was. "The Reverend Wellington Scott," he replied, "and a very curious case. If you would like to know more, come down to my study this evening. That's all about him now." When I arrived at the asylum, Lanton was just about to set out on his evening round. He went to a drawer and got out a notebook. "Read this while I'm away. I'll be back in about an hour. There are the drinks and the goldflakes." When he had gone, I picked up the notebook and saw that it was filled with a very delicate script. I began to read. I remember that the reason for my being in the Pantham district that day was that I was paying a visit to a widowed lady of means, whom I wished to interest in a benefit scheme. A benefit scheme is a scheme which benefits me. I was Mr. Robert Porter on this occasion. £10 richer than when I left it, I was approaching Pantham Station along a small road which topped the railway embankment. I noticed casually a train approaching. It was too early to be mine, when suddenly I saw sparks flashing up from it. It rocked violently, left the rails, and crashed into a bridge. I saw that the third coach was smashed to matchwood, and bodies were hurled from it onto the side of the embankment. I started to run, not for assistance, as you might naturally but erroneously imagine, but to get the story through to the evening news, which might well result in my returning £20 to the good. Suddenly, I stopped in my tracks, for I subconsciously realized there had been something very peculiar about that accident. What was it? And then I knew. I had not heard a sound. I ran back to the top of the embankment, and there was merely a placid row of metals shining in the sun. Whereupon I sat down on the grass and thought things over. Like most superior men, I am somewhat superstitious. I was, therefore, convinced that there was some reason why I, alone of all mankind, should have been vouchsafed this vision. The only supernatural personage for whom I have any respect is the devil, for I believe he looks after his own, which is more than can be said for any of the more reputable deities. I regarded this singular apparition as a hint from him, and carefully recalled the hour of its occurrence in my notebook. I inquired casually at the station, and found there was no train passing Pantham at that time. The vision, then, probably referred to the future, to some new train not yet in Bradshaw. There were many conceivable ways by which I might benefit by a railway accident. The editor of Truth, for example, might be in that third coach, or various other personages whose demise would not be regretted by me. Pursuing this train of thought, I journeyed back to London. Now, I have described myself as a superior man. I had better explain that. A superior man is one who rises superior to his environment. All great moralists, from Mr. Pecksniff to the Bishop of London, would agree with me there. Again, a superior man is one who, by grasping some simple principle concerning humanity, and acting ingeniously upon that knowledge, makes a satisfactory livelihood. 95% of human beings are mugs, for example, which is the one I have acted upon. The Bishop and Mr. Pecksniff might shake their heads over this, but I am convinced it is true. My father followed a peculiar profession. He conveyed second-rate racehorses from one part of the globe to another. Sometimes he'd be conducting a brace of duds to Jamaica, or over to Ireland or France. He received frequent bites and hacks from his charges, but he expected them, and, I believe, was invariably kind to these glorified screws. Consequently, he was away a great deal, but, as this traffic was sporadic, had much spare time, most of which he spent in conveying pints of stout from a pot to his belly. My mother was a good-tempered slut, and the only quarrel she ever had with the pater concerned their respective shares of that filthy fluid. Apart from her good temper and her thirst, there is nothing to record concerning her. My father, a squat, bow-legged little gnome, had that complete, unquestioning belief in the mingled credulity and rascality of his fellow men, which those who are connected professionally with the sport of kings invariably share. Racing, he was wont to declare, consists of mugs, bloody mugs, crooks, bloody crooks, and horses. "And which are you?" asked my mother. "I ain't neither. I just helps the crooks to skin the mugs by moving about the horses. I've seen too much of it. I've seen blokes who was pretty artful at the doings in the ornery way become just too bloody silly whenever they hear the bookies' chorus." He was so convinced of the peculiar opportunities afforded to bookmakers for plumbing the depths of human simplicity that he suggested having me apprentice to their profession, but my mother threw a pot at his head for suggesting it. "I didn't bear my boy to be a bookie," was her inflexible decision. All the same, these repeated references to mugs and crooks had the effect of convincing my childish mind that the world was entirely peopled by these two classes. As an example of the lasting effect of those lessons learnt in infancy, I remain of that opinion to this day. Most of the money for my education went to quenching my parents' thirst, but I was taught to read and write, and acquired the rest myself. In my errand boy days, the only literature I could afford was a newspaper, but this was sufficient to enable me to test the truth of my father's generalization. For the most part, it seemed to me triumphantly to support it. Let me give a few examples. The head of the firm for which I worked was one of the greatest commercial figures in England, and the papers frequently contained articles from his secretary's pen, dilating on the blessings of thrift, hard work, and early marriage to Miss Wright. Yes, he actually used that expression. Yet everyone from the managing director to myself knew that he gambled wildly, ill-treated his wife, and kept a succession of decorative harpies labelled dancing girls. Then one of our assistants helped herself to the till and was given 3 months. She was anemic, scrawny, middle-aged, yet the papers described her as a pretty girl. I marked that down. Obviously, for some obscure reason, the populate preferred their minor female criminals to be pretty, and the papers fostered this harmless inanity. I found eventually that this rule applies to all women under 50 who earn mentions in the press. Again, we resided in a semi-slum near the Marylebone Road, and one of our neighbours brought to a close an argument with another of our neighbours with a chopper. The papers described this as a West End chopper attack, yet anything less West End, as I understood the expression, than Milk Row was hard to imagine. I marked that too. Obviously, the populace found something more stimulating in a West End chopper attack than in a chopper attack in other areas. This extraordinary psychological mystery took me some time to solve, but I learnt to understand it perfectly. And so, as I matured and read and read and read, I realized that there is an absolute and comprehensive difference between life as it appears in the press and life as it really is. I shall not enlarge upon that. For anyone who compares what he reads in the papers about sex, religion, sport, business, the theatre, the many-coloured globe of human activity, with what he experiences himself, knows this to be beyond dispute. When I had proved to my satisfaction that my father was right, I thought very hard. 95% of human beings must like to be mugs and mugged, I decided, must prefer soft tales to hard truths. They must find a solace and a stimulant in being incessantly bamboozled by the other 5%. Newspaper proprietors, bookies, bishops, financiers, and politicians. Certainly, there must be a percentage of mugs amongst these professional men, but roughly they represent my father's crooks. In other words, exploiters of the mass credulity of the 95%. This is not a thesis on human behavior, so suffice it to say that I eventually definitely decided the inhabitants of Great Britain were 95% mugs and 5% crooks, and I used to find great amusement and instruction in following the workings of this truth down the most obscure and unexpected byways of our comic civilization. I was then 18, a very junior clerk. Not to act upon a profound conviction is laziness and cowardice, so I had to make up my mind which I was to be, mug or crook, exploiter or exploited. With the necessity for this decision harshly exercising my mind, I went to the White City one evening to observe the reactions of humanity to the spectacle of a succession of thin, rather graceful hounds in pursuit of a metal mechanism, which I discovered about as much resembled a hare as poor Miss Flint resembled a pretty girl. As a spectacle, it had its points. That deep, dark pool circumscribed by a green and tan track, the focus of the eyes of 95,000 half-wits and 5,000 live-by-wits, the curious, surging, harsh hum of the worst 100,000, the sudden appearance in the distance of a half a dozen tiny white two-legged figures, with still tinier four-legged figures pacing beside them, wandering round the vast arena till they reached a sort of chicken house, into which the two-legged hoisted the dangling four-legged, who, stirred by the sound of a bell and the sight of an individual ascending a peculiarly lousy tower, whimpered and grumbled and thrust eager paws through the bars. All this was admirably calculated to put the mugs into the right mood for the crook's purposes. I wandered about amongst the excited, liquor-sprung horde, fighting their way to rows of leather-lunged sharps who, wedged like unsavory sardines, bellowed out their inane jargon and exchanged pieces of cardboard with their lamentable faces gummed upon them for the silver and paper of the triumphs of evolution. And I made up my mind. Some exploiter, a politician as far as I remember, once, in a gust of vote-snatching sentimentality, declared he was on the side of the angels. He would have been hard put to find an ally at the White City, and he would certainly not have found one in me. It would be humiliating and debasing to be a private in the ranks of muggery, far better to be an officer and a crook. Only so could I keep my self-respect. I considered that this was the decision of a philosopher and a superior man, and I have never changed my opinion. How to begin? I carefully studied the pages of Truth, an organ I have always found most useful. It is an encyclopedia of muggery. Its editor has kept on my track, but he is at a hopeless disadvantage, for there is a sucker born every minute, and a reader of Truth perhaps once a day, odds too great even for a Labouchere. The present editor is a charming personality, and I have to thank his ably conducted periodical for many of my most remunerative conceptions, but I'd have liked him in that third coach all the same. I decided to make a beginning with a begging letter. It hardly sounded like that, for it was manly, suggesting rows of medals, a patient little wife, and many hostages to fortune. It ended with a pathetic suggestion of suicide and a defiant repudiation of the dole. I sent this to a carefully selected list, and netted £84, 13 shillings, 2pence. And then I knew that bounding sense of exhilaration which a man gains from finding that he is desired for success in his life's work. Shortly after, I noticed one who was clearly a policeman in mufti hanging about, so I changed my address. A week later, Truth had a paragraph about me, and was good enough to congratulate me on my epistolary skill, which, it suggested, would eventually bring me to a place where I should have few opportunities of exercising it. My next conception concerned that shocking instance of human callousness, the holiday cat, or rather the cat that doesn't get a holiday or a square saucer of milk when its thoughtless owner is at Southend. In a carefully composed epistle, I reminded a large number of maiden ladies of this sickening victimization, and stated that I should devote any funds provided to the cause of feline felicity. I enclosed with it a portrait of a tortoise-shell animal in an advanced state of emaciation. £122, 10 shillings, 3pence and 3 farthings, and another change of address. This time Truth sat up and took notice. By a flash of genius, it suggested that the honest victim of circumstances, Wilfred Town, and the humane cat-lover, John Reddy, were one and the same person, and expressed the opinion that this combined individual was well worthy of mention in its cautionary list. From these crude beginnings, I advanced to far greater subtlety and versatility, till I was making a steady £2,000 a year, sometimes more. But for one thing I could have retired long ago, and that is the scandalous and narrow-minded and anachronistic bar which prevents women from entering the Church of England ministry. Clergymen are no good for charitable schemes, but they are invariably attracted by possibilities of getting a new suit of clothes by means of a little investment proposition. Maiden ladies, while they like a flutter at times, are splendidly charitable. The combination of these two, a maiden lady parson. Well, it's time our legislators were up and doing. I was convicted once, but knowing more than a little law, got off on appeal, and truth exuberation was short-lived. I have had 74 aliases and 74 changes of address. Except in their charitable aspect, I had practically no dealings with women for many years, but then it occurred to me that the right type might be useful to me for business purposes. There are many little jobs for which a woman is better than a man. One of them is getting money out of men. I didn't mean to embark upon blackmail. It earns too long a sentence nowadays, and is extremely hazardous, but it is possible for women to get money from men without going to extreme lengths. I resolved to keep my eyes open. It was about this time that I had that curious experience at Pantham. I was having tea at an ABC shop one afternoon when the waitress banged down my cup and splashed some of its contents over my spats. I began to remonstrate angrily, and found myself looking into a pair of black, indomitable eyes, battle, murder, and sudden death eyes. So I laughed it off and began watching her as she went from table to table. She was tall and powerfully built, and her face, I was convinced, was that sort which compels men, for some queer reason which has always been a mystery to me, to behave in fatuous, unexpected, and erratic ways. I could see by the expression on it that she was furiously discontented, and in the mood to do something drastic and dangerous to improve her lot. In the mood to exploit male mugs, I diagnosed. I returned to the shop the next day, and had a few words with her. But those few words on my part were very carefully chosen, and she agreed to dine with me that night. She was in the mood I had guessed, prepared to slip a double dose of strychnine into every cup of tea, coffee, or bovril in the establishment. She passionately desired pretty clothes, ease, and power. She expressed utter contempt for every member of my sex. I believed her when she said she was a virgin. Very gently and delicately, I began to explain my means of livelihood, and suggested she should come into partnership. This delicacy I found was quite unnecessary, for she agreed with enthusiasm, and like a true enthusiast expressed herself ready to begin work at once. We started to live together the next day, quite platonically, I may say. I spent £200 on a trousseau for her, and carefully instructed her in the technique of her business. She was a wonderfully apt pupil, and quick study. Within a week, she had a wealthy married member of the stock exchange neatly on the hook. We had agreed that she should retain 75% of any small sums and the value of any present she received. And when I say that my 25% represented £84 in 5 months, the generosity of this expert in American rails cannot be questioned. But then he began to get a little frightened and rather bored, and he gave Charity to understand that she was about to have a more amenable successor. The critical moment. Now blackmail was barred, so Charity merely rang him up at his home and his office about 10 times a day, and he found her waiting for him weeping bitterly every time he entered and left the exchange, much to his chagrin, and the amusement of the men at the door and his fellow members. There is no law against ringing up businessmen at home or at the office, or exhibiting all the symptoms of a broken heart in Threadneedle Street. However, much susceptible stockbrokers may regret the fact. Charity acted beautifully, and I believe aroused genuine sympathy in the breast of this speculator's solicitor, as he handed her a cheque for £2,000, which she and I divided equally, as per contract, and she was brilliantly still a virgin. I grew to admire her greatly, and though we had no sexual relationship whatsoever, sometimes when I heard her turning over in bed, or saw her coming back naked from her bath, I knew vague stirrings and excitement. But I repressed them vigorously, and indeed they were never much more than the ripples on a pond, as compared with the combers off the horn of the average mug. Our combined income for the next 3 years averaged £5,000, not one penny of which went into the coffers of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. By now, I was a badly wanted and notorious person, but I have a sixth sense for evading the constable, and I could see retirement and ease before me very soon, when the one thing I had considered inconceivable happened. Charity fell in love with a poor man in the middle stage of consumption, who most improvidently and prematurely caused her to be with child. After she had told me this, she cut short my remonstrances and protests by informing me she must have money to marry on, and that I must supply it to the tune of £2,000 a year for 6 years. I replied I would make it £200 a year for 3 years, and not a penny more. In that case, she said, I go round to the editor of Truth tomorrow and tell him everything. And ruin yourself? I replied. What's come over you? Be sensible. Have the baby quietly, leave this young dying fool forever, and concentrate on business. A child might be useful to us. I'll think that point over. I shouldn't waste your valuable time if I were you, she answered. And don't be too sure I shall ruin myself. You're the big game they're after. If I give you away, they won't bother about me, and I doubt if they could convict me anyway. And I don't mind betting the papers will pay me anything I like to ask for my story after you've been jugged. Give me time to think, I said. Was she bluffing? I didn't believe so. She was probably right. The police would merely use her as evidence against me, and she would be able to get thousands of pounds for her version of the last 3 years. Yet pay her £2,000 a year for 6 years? It would just not ruin me, and she knew it. The gross ingratitude. I tried to get her to lower her terms, but she was adamant. I don't feel well, and am going down to Folkestone tomorrow for a week. I shall expect your answer directly I return, was her ultimatum. I spent the most wretched night of my life. I saw all that I had planned for going by the board. Sooner or later, I should be forced into extreme recklessness by this dreadful drain on my resources, and then 10 years' hard labor at least. This little vixen I had reared, making her teeth meet in the hand which had fed her for the sake of some broken-lunged piece of worm fodder. I'd like to have flung her into a cell full of drunken stokers. And then I dozed off, and woke in the most confident, buoyant mood. That is why I am superstitious, for I've had this experience several times. Just when I have felt that I was trapped at last, I have had these sudden flashes of confidence and ease, and always something has happened to save me. It would come this time. I went to see Charity off, pretending to be in despair, and imploring her to make some concession. Oh, shut up, she said. I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing it for Jim. He's sweet and he's straight, and I love him. Words you don't know the meaning of, you mixture of dirty crook and frozen fish. So you can work for him or go to Clink and work for His Majesty, and you've got a week to choose. She had just got into a coach about halfway up the train, and I was about to leave when my eye was caught by an individual in clerical attire who was sauntering down the platform and glancing sharply at the people upon it. As he drew near, he seemed vaguely familiar to me. Suddenly he saw me and gave me a quick, meaning look. He passed close to me, and as he went past he said slowly and distinctly, "There's more room in the third coach." The third coach! The third coach! And in a flash I saw a third coach turn to matchwood. "There's more room in front, Charity," I said. "Come along." The compartment was packed, and she came readily. Just as we reached the third coach, the whistle went, and I bundled her into a compartment already filled to the brim. She gave me a venomous glance as the train pulled out, and then I looked round for that slightly familiar individual. He was far down the platform by now, but he turned round, saw me, waved his hand, and disappeared. As the train was passing out, I happened to catch my reflection in a window glass, and then I knew why he had seemed familiar, for his face was mine. I left the station and took a taxi to Pantham Station. During the hour's run, I was in a state of high excitement. About a mile from the station, we were stopped by a policeman. "You can't go down this road," he said. "There's been a smash on the line." "What train?" I asked anxiously. "The Down Folkestone Express." "My God!" I cried. "I had a friend in it." "Well," he said, "they've got the killed and injured on the side of the embankment. You'd better go down there. Anyway, they want help." It wasn't a pleasant sight. I identified Charity by the remnant of her watch garter, which was still hanging to what had been her leg. Then, saying nothing to anyone, I went away. Otherwise, she was never identified. And then, for some reason or other, I became a clergyman. I don't really know why. In fact, I think I've become that individual who told me about that third coach. Here, the delicate little script came to an end, and a moment later Lantern came back. "Finished?" he asked. "Well, what do you think of it?" "A very rascally and curious tale," I replied. "But the most curious part of it is," said Lantern, "that there's not a word of truth in it." "What?" "The Reverend Wellington Scott was a mild, timid East End curate. Going down for a holiday to Folkestone, he was in the Pantham disaster, and hurled from the third coach onto his head. He was unconscious for 10 days, and when he came to, he had to come here. He spends every moment writing that story in notebooks. He completes it twice a week. We read it carefully to see if his narrative ever changes, but it is always word for word the same. He is very docile and easy to manage so long as he is allowed to write. For an experiment, we took his writing materials away, whereupon he delivered himself of the most appalling filth and blasphemy I have ever heard. He never speaks unless he is spoken to. When he first came in, his face was round, chuggy, and ingenuous in expression. It has slowly lengthened, hardened, and its expression has become cunning, watchful, and malevolent. That is the story of the Reverend Wellington Scott. "And the explanation?" I asked. Lantern shrugged his shoulders. "How can there be one? I have known somewhat similar cases, though never so perfect, where some injury to the head has changed the disposition and to some extent the memory, but, as I say, never to this extent. As a matter of fact, one can find traces of the curate in that narrative. A quotation from Shelley, a familiarity with strange types, a distaste for sex and so on, and, of course, the closing sentences. Otherwise he is, as he appears in his story, the precise opposite of what he actually was. Perhaps you may have missed almost the most remarkable thing. His description of the accident, as seen in his vision, is precisely identical with that of the 2 eyewitnesses of it. Yet, of course, he never could have seen it, and he hasn't read a word since he recovered consciousness. I said just now there wasn't a word of truth in that narrative, but that, in a sense, is presumptuous and unscientific. The fashionable theory today is that we each one of us create our own particular God and our own particular universe. It is subjectivity's innings. We certainly create our own truths. Fortunately, in the case of most of us, our truth roughly corresponds with the truth of others. The Reverend Wellington Scott's violently diverges, so we have to lock him up. He has been here a year, and I found he went to a greyhound racing meeting at the White City the night before the accident. Would you like to see him again? Yes and no. On the whole, yes. Lantern took me along a corridor and unlocked a door. The Reverend Wellington Scott was seated at a table, his face partly shaded by a reading lamp. He was writing busily, but looked up after a moment and shot that penetrating glance at me. "I hope you have everything you want, Mr. Scott," said Lantern. "Yes, thank you, sir," he replied, in the mild, slightly clipped, slightly sing-song voice of a stage curate. "But I have one little question to ask of you. Should the words Watchgarter be hyphenated, in your opinion, or not?" "Hyphenated, I think," replied Lantern. "I am much obliged to you, and glad to find that we are in agreement. I suppose, sir, I shall be here for some little time yet?" "Oh, yes, just for a little while longer," said Lantern. "Good night." "Good night, sir," he replied, his pencil already busy again. "Poor devil," I said, as we walked back to Lantern's study. "Is he happy?" "Perfectly," replied Lantern. "There ought to be a deep truth hidden somewhere in that fact. And now for a drink." If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,